Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Steve Hall back on the podcast for, man, I don't even know at this point, 5 to 10 times. We're going to go with that. It's always an honor to have Steve on. Still listen to Steve's podcast all the time, and it's always good to catch up on hypertrophy related topics. I feel like we do this probably every 3 months or so. We catch up and things change. A lot changes in just 3 months, surprisingly. So it will be good to chat with you and catch up. And again, appreciate you coming back on here, Steve.
Yeah, I say, hopefully every time. It's an honor to be invited on, and it's always fun chatting with you, Jeff, because I know we're in this space together and we're primarily practitioners. So we kind of view things a little bit differently than I think some other people do, and also portray and pass on that information in a slightly different way. So it's always nice to have these chats.
Yep, absolutely. And like I said, I know I feel like you've had a ton of good episodes lately. You always do, but I feel like they just continue to get better and better. And
Appreciate that.
I'm sure I think we talked about this last time too, but with the podcast, one of the benefits of it, and I'm sure you can attest to this, it's you really do get to hear other people's like opinions on it. And it really helps you understand what's going on like in the moment with everything. And yeah, I'm sure that you've had a lot of things over the last couple of months that maybe had you not done the podcast, chatted with some people in this industry, you probably wouldn't have the same views on it. So I think it's always good to hear from the researchers and how people are applying it and whatnot.
Yeah, it always helps broaden your horizons a little bit, because I've definitely been guilty in the past of finding maybe one or two experts who I'm like, hey, they're my guys. Whatever they say, I'm following that. A perfect example could be someone like Mena Henselmans, because he does a really good job of always being on top of the research and then putting out actually a really good kind of overview of the study and then his take. And you could quite easily just follow that and take it and be like, I'm good. But he, like everyone, has their own slight biases or their opinions, and people read research and have different takes on it all the time. It's really nice being able to pick and choose and talk to more people. And the more I've done that, probably the same with you, Jeff, is you realize it's not a good idea to just follow one individual, and always be skeptical of almost everyone. Like, don't idolize one person and take it all in. Let time pass, because a lot of people like to jump on things for some reason. It's, hey, let time pass, see what kind of sticks a little bit, and let your thoughts also marinate before you come out with a hard stance. Because I see people doing that and I'm always like, oh, I could never do that.
Yep. Yeah. No, I love that. And I think too, you take a little bit from each person you chat with and apply that to your knowledge base. And then you just get this well-rounded applications to everything. And I think that's what we are trying to do here with this. And I'm sure you feel this way, man. The more I just feel like lately when it comes to hypertrophy in general, I just feel, man, the more we learn, I feel like you do just really have this large range of what works. And it's really just comes down to the individual and finding out what that is for you and what can really get you to just train consistently over long periods of time.
Yeah, I think I've too often recently in my podcasts, at least, whether it's the improvement season or on the Revive Stronger podcast, I've said many roads to Rome. So I was like, I need a different saying. So I'm going for like many ways to skin a cat. I think there's more than one way to skin a cat, something like this. But I agree with you. I think sometimes I even find myself sometimes, by this paper came out, and sometimes I have this initial response. Sorry, the paper that the big take home for people was like, hey, the best quad hypertrophy was 52 sets a week. Something like this will come out. And like you said, things change all the time. And I'll see it and I'll be like, fuck's sake. I'll just be like, science can be, because you have your ways of doing things. You have like a sense of knowing, and then something can come out the blue almost. And you're like, oh, like I have to reconfigure my thoughts a little bit. And of course, it's not like suddenly, clearly I need to do way more volume. Then it's, oh, maybe this just gives me a broader perspective and nudges me in a certain direction. But I can definitely see how people who haven't been following evidence-based practice for a while and maybe aren't that mature yet with their way of thinking, they can just be like, oh man, science, just one week they're saying this, another week they're saying this. I'm just going to go with, this person I trust, or this feels good to me, so I'm going to go with it. And I can't say there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but I like not to be ignorant. Like I don't not knowing the whys behind everything I'm trying to do in the gym, and I need something to guide my practice, which I think the science is probably one of the best ways to do that. So yeah, I don't know if that you relate to that at all.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's and I definitely relate it to the thing that you mentioned there about you see this 52 set study come out, which we'll chat on today, and it's oh crap. All right, now it's got, like you said, you reevaluate, but like you said, at the same time, as you're in it longer, I think you start to realize like you don't really want to put too much stock into one particular study, and like you said, it's getting this large, like we want to get large amounts of data on this. Obviously, these can help. Maybe it shows that hey, you can change things up a little bit, and this may help certain people, but at the end of the day, like you said, you don't want to put too much into one study and have that alter what you do there with that. And then as I've talked to more and more people, and as I've gotten a little bit more into just reading the research and learning more about it, and obviously, like I said, talking to people that are part of it, I think that there's just so many things that go into it. And just now I really feel like I fully grasp the concept of don't just read the abstract or like the conclusion, because you really do need to dive in and see what was going on there with the study and who it was on, what was the duration. Because I feel like with a lot of these hypertrophy studies, I think most of them are 8 to 12 weeks, 16 weeks. And so it's, yeah, that works then, but it's like, how do you can you extrapolate that out to like longer periods of time as well too, which maybe you can, but again, that's where I think having a trained eye in the research and stuff like that can help you a little bit more with this. And obviously us talking to people that are doing it when are really good at breaking down the research, I think is super helpful there too.
Yeah, just as a side note to that, I had Lauren from the Mass Research Review.
Yeah.
So I had her on just recently to talk about some of her area of research. And she basically just walked through what they used to do, because there's not that much research on females because they were somewhat more challenging because of the menstrual cycle and everything like that. And she was just running through how many of the studies were done in the past, and basically how you can't not trust, but you can't really use any of that data because they hadn't standardized for various things within that research. It was just like starting from new here. But I think that's even happened within some of the hypertrophy research where like it's been a long discussion of, hey, using reps in reserve versus training to failure. But on a lot of the studies, they weren't specifically training at a 3 or a 2 RAR or like a lot. I think a lot of us, and I think I also thought that way, where I thought they were doing that. It's just like, hey, it's either not failure or failure. And we have to make some estimations to how close they were to be able to get to that. But it's people like Martin Refalo, who is now, as part of his PhD, he wants to look at the association between reps in reserve, training to failure, and hypertrophy. And he's doing now studies, and they're like, wow, they're like written, they're super ecologically valid. That's how we do it as a practitioner. And actually we can start like some actual studies are more valuable than others. And it's just like you said, if you just read the abstracts, you're not getting anywhere near the information that you need.
Yeah, and I heard that in the past, like when I first got into it, and I was like, okay, whatever. But as you learn more, it's okay. I feel like there's just certain things that you hear a couple times initially, and maybe you're just a little ignorant to what's like going on, and it's okay, yeah, whatever. But then you actually experience it and whatnot, and then you're just like, okay, that totally makes sense now, and it just strikes me in a different way at this point.
I think it was La McDonald did some really cool, I think, articles on partitioning ratios and the P ratio, and how essentially I haven't read, I don't know if they're still even alive and available. I haven't read anything from Lyle in ages, but he was like my go-to guy in the past. I'm pretty sure he was one of the people that kind of pioneered this idea of being leaner. You have better partitioning ratios. You're going to partition more of your calories towards muscle versus fat. And so that led to people wanting to be in a leaner body weight. And then someone like Mike Israetel, I think he also maybe latched onto that a little bit and started talking about it. And that became like for me, it was like a thing. And I spoke about it too. And I was promoting this idea of, hey, you don't want to get too fat in a massing phase because your partitioning ratio is going to be worse. I think it's true, you're going to be less insulin sensitive, but hey, that's going to actually play out that you're going to gain more fat disproportionately to when you're leaner. So I would stay perpetually lean in my off seasons and like in this really tight range and not really gain that much muscle. And I think sometimes questioning your beliefs and really digging into them and be like, actually, this is what people say, but it is actually true. And someone like Eric Trexler, then he actually dug into it and he's like, it's not really any good evidence to suggest this is true. And actually there's evidence to suggest it's completely not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that was, and I know you had Menno, and I think Menno, and maybe it was Eric too. I think maybe you had him on your round table there with, I think.
Yeah, they had a few across different podcasts. I think I had Eric and Mike, and then Menno also came in because I think Menno was more on the side of like pro be leaner because of like inflammation and different factors coming into it. So yeah, again, it comes back to that. Everyone's got their own take on it and what they think. So it's always interesting.
And there probably is some individualization with that as well, too, that you do need to consider. So again, that's where it's like, hey, you take your experience, but obviously that's just one part of the picture there with it. You need to also consider other people. And while we are relatively the same, there is probably at least some difference with some of these minute things here with that. So cool, Steve. Let's dive into what's been going on with you the last couple months in terms of like training and stuff. Man, I'm just, every time I see you post new pictures, man, I'm just like, damn, it's really cool because a lot of these people that I've seen come in, like when I really started getting into this, it's like, you just see them where they're at, right? That's just where they're at. That's how they've always been, but it's probably not that way. But for somebody like you that I know also like you've gone the natural route, like it's been really cool to see like how much you've grown. And every time I'm like, you're one of those people that make me question. I'm like, damn, am I missing something here? What's going on? I'm just impressed by how much you've grown in the last just couple of years. And I feel like every time you post a new pic, it seems like that speeds up even more. So I'm really curious to hear about your training. And I know you're not doing anything crazy or anything like that, but just want to hear a little bit more about your training and whatnot there with that.
I appreciate that a lot. It means a lot for people to have been following for long enough to have seen where I've come to and where I've been able to get to. And if I can be like, don't know, I actually don't, it's so cringy. I literally had that natty night that can be like, hey, you skinny guys, you keep going a decade, like you can get to this point where you look at me and think, hey, is that guy on gear? That can be something that you can do for yourself. But everyone's different with all of these different things. And the longer I'm in this space, especially being a competitor myself and being a judge, just like genetics within this like physique realm are just so damn important, let alone for everything else, but especially for your ability to grow muscle and all those sort of factors. But yeah, I don't know when. So 3 months ago, I think I just finishing up a mini cut or something like that at this
I think
time.
so. Yep.
So yeah, I've just been gaining ever since then. Actually, we're going to be talking about rates of gain rate related to that recent study that Eric Helms was on as well, where they had the different kind of levels of surplus. But yeah, so I've been gaining since then, and I have actually experimented. This is something I don't know if I haven't changed my mind on it necessarily, but I've just tried something different. I'd always been a bit pushy towards, hey, I like generally 1 to 2% of body weight gain per month. So I'd always be more pushy towards the 2% than the 1%, because in my past, kind of going back to the P ratio discussion, I'd always stayed on the skinnier side and was always a bit afraid of pushing up body weight. I'd also found if I didn't push a little bit more assertively, I'd end up not really gaining at the pace that I wanted. But I found this time around, I just wanted to try and be a bit more conservative, in part because hopefully I'll compete next year. And so I just wanted to stay in as much of time away from a deficit as possible. So just slowing that down so I could spend more time massing than cutting and getting too far away from maybe a stage condition. And what was I going to say related to that? So yeah, I've just been gaining more slowly. And actually the benefit that I found was my appetite has maintained much better. The issue I'd often run into is like an appetite issue. I'd get slightly over 190 pounds. Suddenly I can't eat. And I'm normally on 4,000, 4,100 calories. I've just pushed up to around 3,800 and I'm just under 190 pounds. And so I'm gaining at pretty much that lower end of the rate of gain. Interestingly enough, and this came up in the paper too, trying to precisely gain at a certain pace is really tricky. So I gained up at a 2% rate of gain and then maintained the last few weeks. So like in the long run, it looks right. But if you looked like individually across weeks, it might look a bit like, hey, you gained fast here, maintained, or a bit quicker and then maintained. I don't know if that's right, wrong. I don't think we have enough data or research to suggest whatever, but I wanted to be a certain body weight and body fat for, again, competing next year. So I didn't want to try and push it faster just yet. So I pushed up. So that's something I did a little bit differently, is just been less aggressive with my rate of gain. Not that I was ever like really aggressive, but just taking it a little bit slower. And then training, I don't think too much has changed with training. One thing I have been experimenting with since the meta-regression came out with Zach Robinson and colleagues, where they found an exponential increase in hypertrophy as you approached failure. Obviously, there's so many caveats to their study, including the fact that the majority of studies that they assessed were training 2 to 3 times a week. And I'm training 6 times a week. So hey, there's a lot of differences there. But I do still think that kind of general idea of, hey, there's exponential gains as you approach failure probably holds. And whether or not you're better off holding some in reserve and pulling more on that volume lever, it's a question that we don't have a great answer to. But for me, some of my muscle groups where I just found volume, I was pulling on that volume lever to get the stimulus. was things like calves, side delts, lots of the isolation muscle groups. Just I'm going to train those closer to failure. One, they're in a higher repetition range, so my accuracy might not even be as good because we're not as accurate at that. Two, the higher repetition range. Actually, no, I was going to say higher repetition range is less fatiguing. That is scientifically not true. Anecdotally, it depends what we're talking about. Fatigue, I get less joint and connective tissue fatigue and systemic fatigue from those. So again, pushing those a bit closer to failure. So less fatiguing, higher rep work, isolation-based work. I've been starting out, say, after a deload at around a 2-to-1 RAR, and then just kind of baselining it and then trying to progress it each week. And I have found I have to get comfortable with maintaining a performance week on week, because essentially I'm not able to adapt that fast, which is novel to me because I had previously started closer to, say, a 3 or 4. Basically, once I got to a rep that I felt like was hard, I just call it there for week 1 for everything. And I think that was unnecessarily cautious towards failure and the fatigue that failure causes for those isolation lifts. And I've just found the ease of getting that pump disruption that I like to use to know that I've caused enough stimulus for a decent amount of growth. It's been easier to get. So I can do 4 or 5 sets of calves, and my calves are completely blown up, like completely. Whereas I could do that many and I'd be like, do I have to do more calf work? Like I just, and that wouldn't feel great. Same with side delts. I just never really got amazing pumps. And I think it was just like, I wasn't willing to go so far in volume, whereas I was doing 6, 7, 8 sets of a side lateral raise 4 or 5 times a week. So I just wasn't getting driving hypertrophy as well. Whereas now I'm good with 4, 5 sets is plenty within one session for my side delts if I'm training them 2-to-0 RAR. And so I feel like that's really helped and benefited those areas. I did try being a bit more aggressive with lower body with like compound lifts, and that fell on its face very quickly. I was like, the fatigue is just so high. And I find I don't need to train that close to failure to get that kind of sensation of stimulus. For bigger compound lifts and for more fatiguing lifts, particularly lower body, starting out at 3 RAR. So for like your hip hinges, your squat patterns, the leg press, I definitely am more towards 3. Maybe I'm comfortable being at 4 for those and then progressing them. Whereas even something like chest and back, I'm more comfortable going 3, 2. And I guess the take home there is I've just been a bit more, rather than just being like, yeah, start at 3, 4 RAR and then go. I've been a bit more individualized in how I'm selecting my RAR for the fatigue that it will generate, basically, and individualizing that SFR and finding what the sweet spot is for each. And I think that's been beneficial, and it's allowed me to not have to pull on that volume lever as much. And I've enjoyed that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of, I guess, 2 ways to look at that, instead of just starting with a certain amount of like volume for everything, it's, hey, maybe you're gonna again, you're gonna find that SFR for that movement, maybe ramp it up for certain ones, or again, maybe you pull that intensity lever there, and with that, you can get a little bit more out of less potentially there with that. But also, I do the fact that it sounds like individualizing each muscle group as well too, in terms of the RAR, instead of, again, across the board, hey, this is going to be 3 RAR, but instead it's going to be like maybe calves, delts, a little bit closer RAR, just because, again, that fatigue probably isn't going to be there, and you can get a little bit more out of those specific muscle groups. And you mentioned the lower body and specifically compounds. Have you found that maybe, again, that's exercise dependent as well too, or is it just, would you find that in general, just with your quads, just any quad movement's going to wreck you a little bit more than like a delt would, say like a leg extension or something like that?
Yeah, for sure. So leg extensions, I put those in the same category as like higher rep, lower fatigue movements. So I would be closer to failure on those. So again, starting a nearer 2 RAR on those. It's more like you said, the kind of hack squats, back squats, leg press, any of those ones. I'm like, yeah, if I start too pushy with that, I'm suddenly hitting a brick wall, and I'm like, oh, I'm tanking. And that fatigue is felt everywhere. It's actually funny, just as a complete side tangent, I was talking to Jacob Templar, who is, I think he's the strength in evidence physio over on Instagram. But anyway, he was essentially saying he hasn't needed to deload for months. And I was like, what the hell? What juice is this guy on? Like I have to regularly deload every 6th week. It just happens. I just hit a wall. But he's been putting his legs on the back burner and then pushing like high volume on things like delts and arms. And I just think for the majority of people, I imagine you may have even experimented this as well, Jeff, like putting your legs on the back burner. You don't need much to maintain them. But when you're trying, like for me, legs are something that, and particularly quads, I really need to grow those because I just don't have a nice quad sweep. So they just need to be like gigantic everywhere to try and make something look some sort of symmetry that I'm trying to go for, and super fatiguing. And I think that is why I regularly need that deload in that maybe 6th week, whereas someone like Jacob, he's just like, hey, I can run my legs, like not too much volume through them, and I'm good to go for a longer period of time and pushing pretty high volumes like you are everywhere else.
Yeah. So again, probably individual to the person as well, too, in terms of the muscle groups there with that. So not only is each muscle group going to probably be a little bit different, but also, yeah, from person to person, the muscle groups are going to be different as well, too. So that's where really individualizing it can be super helpful there with that. So you mentioned too with the weight gain. So it sounds like in the past you maybe kept yourself a little too lean, like you wouldn't let yourself build any really too much amount of body fat, but then maybe you went on the other side of the pendulum there where it was like, then you started to push that body weight a little bit quicker. Now it seems like you found that happy medium where it's like, hey, I'm not going to stay super lean, but I'm also not going to go as quickly on the way up with my weight gain.
Yeah, I actually initially, when I first bulked, actually I've done many iterations of this. So my first like bulk, I did like a clean bulk and just ate all clean food, and hey, this is on my diet, this isn't, I wouldn't eat that stuff. Eating dessert would immediately put on fat. That was my mindset, and I got real fat very quickly. But this was also after an accident, and I was trying to gain 10 pounds a week. If I wasn't gaining 5-10 pounds a week, I was like, I need to eat more food. So I packed on a lot of size, a lot of body fat. And then after that, I had concerns about gaining fat too fast, but it wasn't too bad. And I think I had actually a pretty healthy relationship with gaining at a reasonable pace. I can't even remember how much I was trying to gain, but I don't remember it being a problem. And I gained pretty nicely. And it was after my first competition prep that I then was like, oh, like P ratios. I started like knowing more about that. And then that's when I was like, my stage weight, I think was 165 pounds. So I wouldn't let myself get over 180 pounds. So 15 pounds above stage weight, which is, I don't know, pretty damn like minimal. And so I just cycle between 5 pounds. Like I'd be like 180 and then I'd go back to 175, 180, 175. And man, I span my wheels big time. So when I competed again in 2017, my stage weight was the same. I looked a little bit better. I still definitely made some progress in that time, but nowhere near as much as I should have. And then that's when I found, or that's when I was getting educated further through Renaissance periodization, Mike Israetel. And he used to be pretty aggressive with his rates of gain. I think he's pulled that back and he hasn't been as pushy with that. And that really just, it was good for me because it was like, oh, that's so different to what I would expect. And man, getting sick of food, I would never, ever consider being sick of food. But it allowed me to get out of my comfort zone a little bit, push a little bit more assertively. And I saw really good progress there because then when I competed in 2021, I gained like potentially 10 pounds of stage weight, which is just like obscene. And it was like stark difference to where I was. And I think that worked really well. And I don't know, the only thing that I'm now thinking about is just, Steve, you hit an appetite wall all the time. That means you have to go through these cycles of gaining and mini cutting, maybe more regularly than you would like to. So I'm just experimenting now, just slowing it down a touch, but I generally really like that 1 to 2%. And I just find when you try and go much slower than that or really pinpoint like a certain percentage, you just end up stressing out and thinking about it more. And so when you see a swing up, sometimes you see these like, I don't know, growth spurts where your scale weight 1 week is just up 2 pounds. You're like, what the fuck? And if you react to that quickly, which you might if you're trying to gain at a slow rate, you might end up then losing weight for 2 weeks. You're like, oh man, like I've just maintained the last month because I'm reacting too quickly. Whereas if you just let it happen, you probably steady out. Maybe it'll just stabilize the next 2 weeks. You're like, oh, now I'm back on track. Like I did. Well, after my mini cut, I was like, oh, I gained a bit fast and then I've plateaued. And I imagine it's going to creep itself back up. I still definitely favor making sure you're in a surplus if you really want to maximize muscle growth because it's hard enough to grow it. I always talk about it as being like cycling uphill. Like it's cycling uphill versus cycling downhill, which is fat loss. Fat loss is super easy. I prefer to make sure I'm properly in a surplus and maybe gaining even a little bit of excessive fat than to not be in a position where I'm gaining muscle maximally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, and maybe we'll touch on this study here in a minute, and maybe what got you to that point. But it sounds like, because I've seen that happen many times too in my building phases, where it's like you just have those weeks, like you said there, where nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, it just like the weight just catches up, and it's okay, what the hell's going on here? So it sounds like with that, two things to look out for there is maybe get yourself out of that mindset of trying to see that scale weight come up every single time you get on the scale, but then also not, if you don't see it go up for a little bit, don't overreact and start to add even more food in, because that could be you overreacting. So you almost have to zoom out and, like, instead of in a fat loss phase, it's, hey, we're going to look like week to week, look at those averages. We can be a little bit more quicker with our decision making there with that. But like when you're in a building phase, you're trying to gain weight here, you probably need to zoom out a little bit and be a little bit more less reactive to the changes, let it play out on longer time scales.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's very reasonable to look at weekly averages during a general fat loss phase and expect it to come down. And if it doesn't, and you have no good reason to think that there's a reason why it hasn't, diet change, stress being high, these sort of things, menstrual cycle, that time of the month, then I think it's reasonable to make an adjustment fairly like assertively. When you're leaner and you're near contest prep, that's when you got to be like, hey, no, we can't just play around with 100 calories up and down. This is suddenly you really dig yourself into a hole. But then in a gaining phase, you're essentially a lot of the time you're trying to gain at like a fourth of the rate of what you're trying to lose at. So it makes sense to like make an adjustment almost at a fourth of the rate of what you would when you're trying to lose weight. So definitely, I think bi-weekly averages are a really good idea. So looking every 2 weeks, how's that trend going, versus certainly not every week, because you start driving yourself into a bit of you get just too quick to change things, I think, sometimes with that.
I'm sure you just really don't want to see, and maybe you can, yeah, I'm curious to hear what you do on this, but like for yourself and clients, you probably just don't want to see any clear trends down like over time. Is that kind of what you're looking for there with that? For the biggest thing with that is just, hey, I just don't want to see anything like trend down over a couple of weeks there with the weekly average weight.
Yeah, I think so. In the past, I used to have this preconception of, hey, after 3-4 months of massing, you're going to have to go through either a mini cut or a maintenance, because you're going to become desensitized to muscle growth. Whereas now I'm like, hey, if after 3 to 4 months you'd meant to have gained X weight, but you're a bit behind it, so you're a bit leaner, just gain for another couple of months. There's no issue about that. So I'm like, it's similar to if you had a pre-planned deload or in week 6, but you feel great in week 5. So, hey, you don't need to like in week 4 be like, hey, week 5 is my final week, so then I'm deloading week 6. I'm going to push double my volume, trash myself, just extend the mesocycle a little bit longer. And I think I think that's just a better way to go about it. So yeah, I'm definitely with you there. I don't want to see people's weight going down. And ultimately, the adaptations to a surplus, especially once you've been in it for a while, or rather, there's quick adaptations immediately out of a cut where, hey, your metabolism slow down a little bit because of the diet and everything, and then it ramps up. So you don't want to like jump calories up too high. Your new predicted maintenance is a bit lower, but it ramps up fairly quickly. Then you get to this really steady period where most people can be on the same calories for like months on months and gain at a really slow pace. And then maybe, depending on the person, you get to this like upper intervention point or body fat where it's, hey, for me, my body doesn't want to get above 195 pounds. So to do it, I have to push 4,000, 4,2, 4,3. I have to get quite aggressive to get over this wall. But for the most of the time, like you can just stay on this like historic caloric intake that just leads to you gaining at a very nice slow pace.
Yeah, and so maybe there was that recent weight gain study that came out from Eric Helms. Well, I think it's in preprint. I don't think it's that. I don't think the actual study came out yet. I could be wrong on that. I don't know for sure. But yeah, maybe if you want to just hit on that, like your kind of thoughts on it. I feel like at the end of the day, it probably just solidified what we had already thought with the weight gain. But I don't know if that guided your decision making on it or anything, or if it changed any ways that you go about your coaching or anything like that.
It didn't change anything, but it was a good study because we really lack good studies on caloric surplus for muscle gain, which makes sense because what a like interesting thing to study. Like most of the time it's like, hey, we've got an obesity epidemic. Like we don't need to know about like surplus. It leads to fat gain. We don't want this. But it was definitely interesting because they had maintenance, they had a 5% surplus or a 15% surplus. One of the really interesting things that I don't think was talked about that much was the people targeting 5% or 15% surplus ended up in the same place. They were all in the same level of surplus. I actually don't know the precise surplus they ended at, but that's something I was getting to with targeting Like I say 1 to 2%. You might have even had this, Jeff. You'll be like, this is the range you want to land in. And they'll message you and be like, so 1% or 2%. And you're like, I told you, land in the range. Don't try and obsess about one particular number. And that's exactly what happened in this study, where they were targeting 5 or 15% surplus. They landed up in the same place. So even when you try and go for a particular amount, it's very challenging too. And then the maintenance group was there too. And they found the amount of muscle you gained was proportional to the surplus. You gained a little bit more muscle for the larger surplus, for being in a surplus versus maintenance. Let's just say that. But the kind of body fat you gained, the higher the surplus was like exponential. So it's, hey, you might gain a little bit more muscle being in a slightly higher surplus, but you gain much more body fat. And this is going to cut back your time that you can be in a calorie surplus for. So it comes back to our scenario where it's, hey, if you gained a little bit slower, you can just gain for a little bit longer, and you'll probably end up in it. If not a better place, it's certainly going to be a very similar place. I don't think there's anything you have to be in a certain size of surplus to even give your body a signal to gain muscle. I used to think that could have been a thing. Hey, we need to have a certain level of overload to grow muscle. So maybe we need a 50% surplus to like force feed this muscle gain. That probably doesn't make sense. You're probably going to get real fat. So yeah, I think it really helped confirm, hey, maintenance, you can grow muscle, but a surplus is superior. But you don't want to be in a bit too big of a surplus, because you just end up gaining fat, and that's going to cut back the amount of time that you can be in a surplus for. So just like you mentioned, trying to make sure you're just in net positive most of the time and just nudging it in that direction over time, I think is a good take home from that study.
Do you think, would this depend on training age too? Do you think there was anything there with that you would factor in, or do you think it's still, hey, whether you're relatively newer to maybe being in a surplus and whatnot, it's just, hey, same thing. You still want to just make sure you're not going too fast or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's similar to, hey, if you're fatter, you have more body fat to lose, you can lose faster. If you're leaner, decrease your rate of loss because you've got less body fat to be able to lose, and you risk losing muscle. So, hey, if you're more advanced, you've got less muscle gain potential as when you're more novice. So, hey, let's try and individualize your rate of gain according to that. And most people I work with, at least, are intermediate. So they've trained at least consistently for 2 years at least. They've made their newbie gains all the way up to, hey, they've been training a decade. And I just find everyone in that kind of, you're trained, you just want to make sure you're in a surplus. And I don't really individualize the rate of gain according to their training age like that, because I just haven't found that to be practically valuable. Again, it just adds another layer of, hey, that's just challenging. And also, what if that more novice individual gains a bit slower, but they gain less body fat and they just can gain for longer? Or maybe they even recomp a little bit. It just doesn't bother me if that is happening, and I can't be sure. So I just like that range for almost every individual who's intermediate plus. One thing I think is interesting to think about in terms of individualizing a rate of gain is individualizing it based off how good of a position they are in to gain muscle, which is similar to training age. But also, you could have that individual who is, say, they're fairly novice, but they also have their sleep dialed in, their nutrient timing dialed in, they have all their protein dialed in, their technique is amazing, their intensity is there. They are a muscle growth machine at this point. They probably can get away with quite a sizable surplus. If you've got someone who's advanced, they're already in a poor position to gain muscle because of the fact that there's just that kind of resistance to muscle gain once you're relatively advanced. And then if their sleep is poor, if they've got high stress, if their nutrient timing is off, man, they're not in a good position to gain muscle. So they may even be like, hey, just maintain, which actually just leads me to another thought about advanced. People talk about a natural ceiling. And I just wonder, and they talk about, I don't know, people would just say, oh, I just gain fat when I'm in a surplus. I think I've hit my natty limit. But are you putting yourself in the best position to gain muscle? Because you're already in a bad position because you're advanced. I wonder if people just hit this. It's not like a natty ceiling. It's just like a lifestyle ceiling where it's, hey, I've got kids. I've got like my own business that I'm running. Stress is high and I'm advanced. So I can't even push my training very hard in terms of, I don't have the time to be able to give the amount of volume or intensity that I need to. And my sleep is trash, whatever. So I wonder if that's something I've been thinking about recently, or I was like, I don't know if people I doubt anyone really hits a natty limit as such. I think normally age hits you, but before age, it might just be this like lifestyle limit that comes in.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I'm not sure if you've dealt with this or heard this, or maybe people have reached out to you about this, but it's like you hear a lot of people that like maybe they've tried to do like a surplus, and for one, they probably did it where they went too quickly. But even independent of that, I feel like there's a lot of people that maybe training's, like you said, training's not there and it sleeps off, and that's a bigger fish you got to fry there with that versus worrying about the exact range that you need to gain weight and stuff like that, because that does play like that has a massive impact on your ability to be able to grow muscle, right? Like you said, sleep, that right there is probably a massive one. I know that's something that you specifically have really tried to dial in over the last couple of years, as your sleep. And I'm sure that's probably played a large role in your ability to build muscle and the change in the physique that you've had.
Yeah, I think actually this is a great circle round where you're saying the gains that I've made are relatively like impressive. Like I'm very fortunate that I'm in a position where I'm like, hey, I work from home, I work for myself, and I have just a girlfriend and I have a dog. I don't have kids. I don't have huge responsibilities. I'm financially secure. I mean, my gym is a 5-minute walk away. I have so many things lifestyle wise in my favor. And I completely feel people who are like, man, talk about getting 8 hours of sleep. You've never had kids or like all of this. I'm like, I get it totally. Like I'm lucky in some ways, or this is just my environment. You could call me unlucky for not having kids, depending on how you feel about all of that. But I'm just, and this has always been my philosophy is, hey, when the going's good, just run at it. So I'm just like, hey, I'm in a great position to really capitalize on my bodybuilding right now in my life. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to see what I can get out of it, because I know there's probably going to become something in future that will mean that I can't do that. But yeah, lifestyle is something people, it's like you said, why aren't I gaining muscle? It's, hey, there's so many things that you need to have in check before you can expect that muscle's just going to come to you.
Even the training aspect of it, I think a lot of people overlook the importance of the training aspect. Again, they look at, like, obviously the nutrition's important. Like we need, like you said there, we want to make sure we're in that surplus to, that's going to be, you can build it at maintenance, but it's like really to maximize muscle growth. It's like that surplus is needed there to really maximize it. But again, I think people jump the gun on that and they overly focus on that. And it's, you look at their training and it's, oh man, you just got so much there. Because, and the reason I bring this up, and maybe you noticed this in the study, but I remember reading in the study, there was, I think the people that were in the larger like surplus, I think they trained their biceps maybe with a little bit more volume or a little bit more intensity. I remember seeing something along those lines. I don't know if you can check that for me, but, or if off the top of your head, but it seemed like for them, they did see a little bit more muscle growth in their biceps when they were in that larger surplus, but they really were able to, I think from my understanding, really push their bicep training. So to me, that was like, okay, maybe that's really the thing that you need to really pay attention to here, is how are you setting yourself up to really have that really productive training and really push yourself in the training. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that, and if you saw that or picked up on that.
It's been a while since I've read the paper, but when you were talking me through it, I absolutely remember those sort of things, because it was trying to feed my bias of like slightly larger surplus, which is like slightly my bias. I was like, hey, look, they did more volume like for their biceps. And yeah, I think the researchers even said something like, hey, this is limited because they're only training 3 days a week as well. So what if they're training 6 days a week? Like suddenly the larger surplus, maybe that starts to become more in favor, because again, it comes down to that muscle growth stimulus. If someone's advanced, they've got poor nutrition, poor sleep, and they're doing low volume, and volume seems to have a dose response relationship to hypertrophy. It's, hey, that's not a great position. But if they've got all their ducks in a row and they're pushing training volume and recovering from it, you don't know, they could actually like really grow some serious mass there. So yeah, I think it's like you said at the start, you have to read the studies, because you pull out these little details which, once you understand the general principles of training and nutrition, you pull out little things that you're like, that's really interesting. Because I can't remember, I think it was the old study that always used to get used for surplus. Was it like a Garth or
Garth,
something
yeah.
like that? Garth, yeah. And that was basically to say, hey, look, when you go into a large calorie surplus, you end up just gaining loads of fat. And I remember digging into that because, again, my bias was, I think a big surplus can work in certain scenarios. And the guys that were in that training study were also like athletes or something like this. And I was like, the population that they used just weren't like pure out and out bodybuilders who are specifically going for all out muscle growth. And it was just, again, it's why we need more research. And I also think, coming back to size of surplus, you can also probably see it in yourself. When you're gaining slowly, like you can't take a picture every week and be like, hey, I'm going to adjust my surplus up by 100 because I'm still really lean. That's not how it works. But you can probably see it like month on month. Hey, this person just seems to be gaining like lots of body fat. Maybe we just pull it back a little bit. But it is tough. I think mostly it will come back to make sure you're in a net positive environment most of the time. And that's the best you can probably do. And then when you're too fat, cut.
Yep. And take into consideration people like yourself that maybe you have some pretty bad like reaction, like not, I guess you'd call it a reaction. I don't know what to say exactly there, but it's once you really push that weight gain, it's now your hunger goes down the drain, and it's now that's just not even as productive at that point. So again, the individualization I think is super important there. But yeah, super interesting stuff there on the weight gain. Is there anything else from that study that I guess to tie it back in also with the training aspect of it, to go back to the lifestyle thing that you talked about there with the sleep and stuff like that? And again, that's also going to set you up for that, to be able to have that productive training as well too. So again, I think it all goes in together there.
Yeah, the only other thing on that study was they didn't individualize for training age. They had people all the way from novice to very advanced people. They didn't differentiate between that. So that's really going to impact the results that you get from such a study. So it'd be really great to see them actually take people who have been training like 5 years consistently, like 4 times a week or something, with like good 1RMs, and then take them through a study, or maybe take them through it and have like different volumes or something. It would just be interesting to, more research is needed, as they say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that makes sense. Like somebody they've been training for a lot longer, do different volumes to see how that impacts it. Then, like you said, even in that GAR study, it was probably more on athletes. So that's obviously important to know, because like you said, they're not going to be training specifically for hypertrophy, which ultimately is going to impact what you're gaining in that process. Yeah. So I guess really to sum that up, it's like, hey, don't go too fast. Being at a small surplus is definitely the way to go. But again, obviously figure out what works best for you on that. And yeah. Would you say that pretty much summed up that study pretty well there with that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just worth realizing. And I think a nice little take home for some people is you can gain muscle at maintenance. So if that feels like psychologically easier for you, or you need to do a period of maintenance for whatever reason, don't feel like, oh, there's no point training hard or whatever. Keep pushing all of that, because you could still be gaining something.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too, right? It's just because it's not necessarily optimizing or maximizing muscle growth doesn't mean you still aren't building muscle in that process. It just might be a little bit slower. Take that into consideration. That's a really good takeaway there. So cool. Well, let's wrap up the end of this chat with talking about volume a little bit here. I'm just, more so than anything, I'm just curious to hear where you're at right now on the volume stuff, right? Because yeah, I just want to see what you're at there with that, and maybe we can talk about some things that might impact the amount of volume you do, because I do think that's super important. And then I know there was that new study from Inez that we were talking about off air, and I'd be curious to hear where your thoughts are with that. So I know I threw a lot at you there, so yeah, I'll just let you take that where you want to start that.
Yeah, I think I had a vlog that came out a while ago, and I was like, I think I called it something like the key variable that not many people talk about. And I'm coming down to stimulus. So I think a lot of people talk about intensity and they talk about volume. And this comes back to what we were talking about off air, where it's, oh, maybe it was on it. I can't remember. Many roads to Rome, or many ways to skin a cat. This sort of situation where it's, hey, if you can pull on one more than the other, and there's an optimization question of which one, what balance of the two do we want? Because you can't actually, the classic quote is like a bodybuilder going like, you go like high volume and high intensity. So that's conflicting because there's just so much fatigue. You can't actually do that. So it's normally lower volume, higher intensities, or if you go higher in volume, on average, lower intensities. And you definitely need to meet an overload threshold for both. I think that theoretically makes complete sense. You got a minimum effective volume you need to achieve. If you do too little than that, you're certainly not growing at your best rate, and maybe not even at all. Similar with intensity. If you're not training hard enough, you're simply not really going to be growing very much at all. I think you can probably train, like even the meta regression showed this, if you train heavy enough, you can train really far from failure and still apparently be growing. But I think it's practically, we have these thresholds. So maybe it's a 3 or 4 reps in reserve. Maybe it's, depending on the muscle group, anywhere from 5 to 10 sets that you need to do per week. But it also comes into question of, in terms of volume, there's so many, intensity is part of that equation, but then it's also, where is that coming from? So are we talking 5 to 10 sets of, like for quads, leg extensions? Or are we talking 5 to 10 sets of squats? Or are we talking a combination of that? So it gets a little bit complicated when you start assessing those different variables. So the thing that I said not many people really speak about, and I think they probably do, but maybe not in the way that I do, is stimulus. That's what I'm after, is the stimulus for growth. And so rather than necessarily conceptualizing minimum effective volume, maximal adaptive volume, max recoverable volume, I'm also looking at like a minimum threshold for stimulus, like your max adaptive stimulus, and then what's the most you can get done, and then come through potentially a period of backing off, which I like that conception because it negates some of the issues. It's, hey, if you're doing quads, maybe you need 10 sets of it. If it's leg extensions, maybe you need 5 sets if it's all squats or something like this. And maybe a combination gets you somewhere in the middle there. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with this, because that's what a lot of people dislike. I think the recent systematic review, which was from a Nico, I think, and that said 12 to 20 sets was like the optimal gains like range. But that also only assessed like a small select number of training studies. It also, some muscles have never been assessed because they're just difficult to assess, like the lats and like the back in general. It's super complex. It's really hard to like actually measure muscle growth in it. So it hasn't really been assessed. We have quite limited data with all of that. And then, yeah, there was this other study that came out where it's just like these people moved all the way up from 22 sets across 12 weeks up to 52 sets. And they got the best growth. And it was like, there was a dose response effect. Like the group that maintained 22 sets from the start to end saw the least growth. 42 sets was the peak volume, 22 at the start. And then the other group with the 52 peak volume grew the most. It's, that's a lot of volume. I don't know if you know how many sessions that was split between, but I think it was like 3 sessions or something it was split between. And that kind of goes against some of the discussion, which is based around some of the research in terms of like your junk volume limits per session too, where it's like, hey, maybe 10 to 12 sets per session per muscle. Is if you start going over 12 sets in a session for one muscle group, you're starting to just create more muscle damage and you're not able to recover from that. And therefore it's now not causing growth for you. You're just like having to, like, you just beat yourself up for nothing. But this study goes against that a little bit, where it's like, hey, these people were doing like, they'd have to be doing, I think it was 3 sessions, which would make sense that their volumes were quite a bit above that.
So I think it said participants performed a lower limb training program twice a week for 12 weeks.
Okay.
So twice.
Okay.
Unless I'm
even
reading
more
that right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, splitting 52 sets between 2 sessions
especially for
mad.
the legs, for the quads.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So I guess with that, then obviously, like you said, there's this interplay here with the volume talk, where it's like intensity is obviously going to impact that. The exercise selection that you're going to do there is going to impact that. I'm sure even like things outside of the gym are probably going to impact that as well too. Your recovery, that will certainly play a role there with that. Would you like, where do you fall in this range? What do you like typically see, maybe for yourself, and then for, you work with a lot of clients and bodybuilders as well too. What's that range that you like typically see there with the volume per week?
I would say on average, it's towards the lower end of what the 12 to 20 is. So I don't typically start people at much more than 12. Like maybe if they're relative, like assuming I have no history or background behind them. But even with that, I'd probably still reduce their volume from where they've been, because I always like to start on the lower end and then auto-regulate it upwards depending on their recovery performance, that kind of biofeedback that they're getting to help me assess that. But for the most part, it will be like somewhere between 6 to 12 sets is where I'll set per muscle per week in the first week. And then I'll see how they're responding to that. And for some people, they just find once they've got that training intensity there, where they're truly starting at 3 or like a 1 RER in that first week, depending on the movement, then they find they don't really need to add set volume week on week. They can just add volume through an additional rep, basically getting a little bit closer to failure each week. And then here or there, additional sets. And that's what I found for myself too, where I used to find it's like my starting volume was like, I don't know, say it was at 10. I'd easily be at like 20 sets for everything by like week 4. It was just, I could just keep adding all of these sets. It didn't quite make sense to me on reflecting on it. So now I'm much more like a step higher, where maybe I'm between anywhere from 6 to maybe 15 for something like my back. I'll start there for week 1, and then I'll only add like maybe a handful of sets throughout the whole meso if I really feel like it's something that I'll benefit from. But I'm much less set addition happy as I used to be. And I think it's just because I start actually in week 1 training really quite hard. And I think that was an error I made in the past, where I was like, I didn't quite start out the mesocycles as hard as they needed to be. And I find when people do that, they don't need to pull on that volume lever as much. But certainly, and again, people, including myself, like to hit against that like 10 to 20, 12 to 20 recommendation. Actually, in practice, often works out quite well. It's just some muscle groups like hamstrings get left behind, where it's like they generally are either 6 to 12, something like this for those. And the legs generally are on the lower end. But things like delts can quite often be up to 20. So can be the back. But maybe there's not many studies that have assessed like stupidly high volumes like this one, where it's like 25 plus sets. So
Yeah.
the study says something.
Yeah, like you said too, even you're within that range, but then like you said, even the muscle groups are you need to pay attention to that, right? Because this might not apply for everything. So again, starting on that lower end and seeing how your body responds. And as you were saying that too, it made sense. Okay, if you're starting a little bit further away from failure, you feel like you have a little bit more in you. So then you do start to ramp up that volume. But then as you lower the intent or increase the intensity and the volume, it's just that like massive, like everything's coming together at once there on that. So yeah, I agree. I definitely have dialed back on the set progressions as well too, and that seems to be super helpful there. And only do it on an as needed basis. I think more so auto regulating that and seeing if you need to do it, right? Because I had a conversation with somebody the other night. He was asking me, is there any research that shows that adding sets over the mesocycle is more beneficial? I'm seeing pretty good results by not doing that, and I'm just like, look, if you're seeing good results by not doing that, could you add a set or two or make small increases? Like you could try it, right, and see like you might be able to get a little bit more hypertrophy out of that. But if you're seeing good results and you're happy with that, I don't think you like have to do that or anything. I think we get ourselves into trouble when it's, oh, we have to add sets or something like that. It's like, again, auto regulate it and see what your results are there with that.
Yeah, I completely agree. There hasn't really been much research. Actually, I think this might have been the first paper on it where they actually added sets like on a weekly basis. I think they said something like that. The first paper to look at gradual it was the first paper to look at gradual set increases versus static sets. So obviously it's the average volume was different. And I guess they hypothesized that the group that would gradually increase sets would see like a dose response related relationship with hypertrophy. But yeah, we need more research on that. And I think the basis of adding sets, when I reflected on it, I like the concept of it and it made sense, but a whole set is quite an additional amount of extra volume.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, it's quite a lot of extra volume, first of all, but it's also quite a lot of extra stimulus. If you add a set of hack squats and you've gone from 2 to 3, that's actually huge jump in what you're doing. And is the reason because you're adapting to that stimulus that quickly? I'm like, no, it's still meeting a volume and like intensity threshold. You don't suddenly need a whole additional set to still keep growing at your best rate. It didn't make sense to me in hindsight. So I'm very much like you. If I'm like, man, I'm doing 2 sets here, but I'm easily recovering from this. My muscle doesn't feel that fatigued and I haven't got that much of a pump. I'm going to add a set here and see how that goes. But in the past, it was like you said, I would feel amazing week 1 because I'm at like 3-4 RAR with low volume. Of course, I'm going to add sets next week. And I get into this situation of actually, I would call it like a volume trap where you add so much volume because you feel so good. But now your intensity can't be where it should be because you're like, I would have 5 sets of hack squats in my final week. I'm like, if I tried to do 5 sets of hack squats now, that better be like close to all the quad training I'm doing for the week. I can't survive much more than 2 or 3 sets of those big compounds for quads without my like session performance just tanking now because I truly am training hard enough.
And that brings up a good point here with this particular study. Did they track what was the intensity like for them, right? Because
yes,
they did track the intensity of it.
So they were at 2 RAR and then the final set they took to all out failure from what I gather. Oh, I don't know what their definition of failure was. It was probably concentric, maybe volitional. It was maybe volitional failure. I expect it probably was. So they should have been training pretty hard.
Because again, I just wonder again if it's like, hey, if they're increasing all this volume, did that change? But it sounds like it didn't, because we know from my understanding, hey, you can probably get away with these higher volumes, but you might have to, like, your intensity is going to decrease a little bit. So I think that would be an interesting thing there. I'm not sure if they looked into that or not. So was this study more of a volume study, or would you say it was more of like a figuring out if adding volume was beneficial?
That's a good question. It was probably a bit of both because they were looking at gradual set increases versus static volume, but it was also comparing different amounts of volume increases. So they had a high volume, really high volume, and super high volume group with 22 to 42 and 52 by the end. So I think it probably was fair to say they were comparing both of those things and seeing how did that play out.
Do you have any specific questions on this study that you would like to learn more? Not to ask me, but I know you said you're going to have Dr. Schoenfeld and
Yeah.
Pack on. What were some things? What were your any takeaways? Did anything change your mind? And then also, did you come out with more questions as well too from this?
Yeah, it's like we said off air. I'm in the middle of reading it, and I have read a good chunk of it. And something, it might change once I've read it all. But one thing I'm interested in is if they were maintaining a 2 RAR for every set, then they had to drop the load to maintain any sort of decent reps. And it's at what point does the load just get so light that it's like it's truly junk volume? And obviously they grew the best here, and I'm a bit conflicted there because, as an example, it was partly influenced through reading this study, but I was in my final leg session the other day, and I had leg press. I had done 2 sets throughout the entire meso. I did my 2 sets, and I was like, and they were both to 0 RAR, and I was like, I'm tanked, but I'd been thinking about adding a third set a few weeks where I was like, could I? So I added a third set just because I was like, I'm deloading from the next day. And I reduced the load 10%, and I literally couldn't even match the reps anywhere close. I was like, I think I got 7 reps, and my set before that with 10% more load at 0 RAR, I got 12 reps. So I completely tanked my performance. I was like, it didn't feel productive. It just felt like it was tiring me out. And then when I went on to leg extension, my first set I did well. And then every set after that was complete. My performance completely plummeted.
From
And
the
I was
previous
like,
week?
yeah, exactly. I just couldn't even get close to even maintaining performance. So I was like, clearly my quads are just cooked. I can't. Is that training still good training? Because they also, one thing that was interesting with this study, not only were they maintaining 2 RAR each set, so they had to drop the loads, they're only having 2 minutes of rest. Imagine having 2 minutes of rest after a 2 RAR squat. I'd just be like, you'd be stripping plates off to the point where I'm just doing the barbell.
And you said you don't know if they were taking the weight off the bar, or they weren't in this
I'm
study.
pretty sure I mean
They
they
had
had
to.
to. I don't remember reading that, but I did talk to Pack a little bit about it, and he was like, that's essentially what he was saying. He was like, they had to reduce the load on the bar because there's just so many sets, and with 2 minutes of rest, you're just not anywhere near recouping performance. And it's just like, what point me squatting the bar is no longer meeting that overload threshold. So is that, how is that not junk volume? It just, so that's one question that I have. And then the other one I have, and I don't know how much you know about this, Jeff, but it's something I see critiques of these high volume studies regularly, is how they measure hypertrophy, and are they just measuring like that pump and inflammation that you get from doing just crazy volumes? And they did ultrasound 72 hours after the last workout. And I just don't know if that's enough time to have allowed everything to have dissipated. I know I get sore. Like if I was, I don't know, if I did this, I'd be sore for a month. So I'm like, hey, I wonder if that was enough time to let that really clear.
Especially with such high volume and probably like muscle damage in general too. I would imagine the more you stress that, the longer it's going to take for it to come down as well too, which like you said could impact like the inflammation and stuff like that when they're measuring it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I just also wonder what's the like practical take homes from this, because I know some people like to, I don't know if you do this, Jeff, but some people really like to do specialization phases where they only pick 1, 2 muscle groups, everything else will be on the back burner. It's just nothing I've ever really personally enjoyed. The programming will look weird to me where I'd have some really like hard, high volume sessions, some very low ones. I'm not sure how that would really look. I tend to like prioritize, and that's mostly done through exercise order and then a little bit of volume progression for the areas that I'm prioritizing. But that's the only way I could see this being something where it's, hey, if you want to specialize on quads, don't train the rest of your body and do 52 sets and like your quads will grow the best they ever have. But what happens to the rest of you? And could you just take a more conservative approach where you're training everything and it's growing at an okay pace and just get in the same place without taking these extremes? Or do we have to do something crazy and extreme like this to see our best growth and move it around muscle group to muscle group? I don't know. I hope not. But I'd struggle to have to conceptualize just training like one muscle group like crazy and everything else just like barely at all.
Yeah, that concept makes sense based on some of this, where we do see the higher volumes. But like you said, and again, I think with it being like a short-term thing, it's okay. So you can get away with maybe doing this higher volume for a shorter amount of time, but you can't do this for every muscle group. So I know the guys at Data Driven Strength, they hinted at, hey, there might be something to that where it's like you do prioritize a couple muscle groups and ramp up the volume. So it will be interesting to see where that goes there on that. But like you said, I definitely, as you were mentioning that, yeah, I guess I could see where potentially the training could get altered, but that's where maybe you could pull the frequency lever. There's just so many different ways that we could go about this. And I'm sure that it's funny, these studies can be helpful, but they also bring up more and more questions of, okay, what about this now?
Yeah, that's the fun of it though, isn't it? That's what keeps me engaged. Like
Yep.
the podcast has been going so long that I've been running. It's like some people are like, how do you keep doing a weekly podcast? It's because there's actually still
Always.
interesting studies coming out and we don't know. Like people like to, people even say, oh, the bros always knew. Like with length and partials, it'll be like, yeah, the bros were doing length and partials and doing the stretch position back in the day. It's, yeah, but they also did a load of other shit that like, and they still do stuff like fasted cardio is not inherently better, but
They
yeah,
still do
it's,
that.
I still find it interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to find out about that. And I know Milo also hinted at that in his post about this too. Okay, potentially with these specialization phases and whatnot. So it'll be interesting to see some stuff that comes out around that. So any other takeaways from this study? I'm assuming it probably didn't change really anything from a practice standpoint, but yeah, I didn't know if we wanted to wrap up this particular study, if there was anything else you missed, you wanted to point out or you found interesting or any takeaways.
I don't think so. I might have more once I've read it all, but at the
Yeah.
moment, the ones, yeah, I don't think there's anything like particularly interesting. The only thing I was going to say is they did increase load week to week. So there was like a progressive overload element as they adapted to keep them training close enough to failure. So yeah, you'd think that, yeah, hopefully they were training pretty hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it will be interesting to hear that and obviously hear this study was not done by Brad and Pack and stuff, but they probably have a good idea. But they are having something coming out soon, from my understanding, around volume.
Yeah, they're doing it from the looks of things, a meta-analysis again to come out. So I'm guessing this study's included and all the studies, so they probably have a really good idea of what's going on. So yeah, it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say about it.
And that's going to be a meta analysis on the like overall volume and volume for hypertrophy and all those studies.
I believe so. I don't
Yeah,
quote me on that, but I think that is in the works. And maybe I think like some of the guys from Data Driven Strength might be working on that too. So
yeah.
it'll be interesting.
Cool. Yeah, always, like you said, there's always going to be more and more stuff that comes out, and we'll just continue to get more information on this. Steve, is there anything else that you want to hit on? Maybe anything we missed out on throughout this? If not, just let the audience know where they can find you and anything coming out on your end.
No, I don't think there's anything else. Not from me. Like I said, Jeff, I always enjoy these chats and I appreciate you taking the time. And I'm excited for all this stuff that's going to come out. And yeah, if the listeners want to make sure they don't miss out on that roundtable, be sure to check Revive Stronger. Our website's revivestronger.com. That's our coaching. And you can find the podcast, everything over there. I'm Revive Stronger over on Instagram. If people want to reach out to me, I'm also on. Are you on Threads, Jeff?
A little bit. I got into it a little bit. I know
I
you're
forget
posting
about
pretty.
it.
Yep, yep.
I think I posted like 4 in a row yesterday or something, and I was just like, Steve, why are you like this? I just had 4 things come to my mind. I'm just like, hey, this is dumb. Shall I post it? I was like, yeah, I'm gonna post it. It's just Threads. Who cares?
Yeah, that's like a place where maybe you can just do like a brain dump and you don't have to like have it be as methodical as like posting on Instagram or something like that. Yeah, Steve, really appreciate your time and looking forward to hearing more awesome episodes coming out on Revive Stronger podcast. That's it for now, and we'll have you on again, obviously, and we'll chat with you then.
Cheers, Jeff.